"Pretend to be my wife," the Mafia boss whispered, but she was shocked by his one condition. The underground gala was a galaxy of glittering diamonds and predatory smiles. For Lucy Vargas, it was a foreign, hostile planet. She gripped the slim strap of her second-hand clutch like a lifeline, acutely aware of the weight of 100 calculating gazes pressing down on her simple ivory dress. Her college roommate, a girl who had once split ramen noodles with her on a cracked linoleum floor, had married into this shadow-drenched world of old money and older sins, and she had insisted Lucy come. "You'll be fine. Just smile and don't make eye contact with anyone wearing a signet ring." But now, marooned beside a towering arrangement of black orchids and white roses, Lucy felt less like a guest and more like a sociological experiment gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. Across the cavernous ballroom, Nino Mendel felt a different kind of entrapment. He was cornered by his own lieutenants, 3 formidable men in bespoke suits who were steering him, with the subtle, iron-willed grace of experienced handlers, toward a woman draped in red silk and the expectant smile of a political alliance. "Her father controls the port routes, boss," his right-hand man, Marco, murmured close to his ear, the words smooth as a blade being drawn. "One photograph. That is all they need. Something suggestive of a future arrangement." Nino's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He felt like a prize stallion being paraded before buyers, assessed, appraised, and quietly auctioned off for the benefit of the empire. His dark eyes swept the room with the cold, unhurried precision of a man who had learned long ago that sentiment was a luxury that got people killed. And then his gaze stopped. Across the ballroom, half hidden behind the floral arrangement, was a girl who looked exactly as trapped as he felt. She was striking in a way that had nothing to do with jewels or couture, a quiet, unassuming beauty with intelligent blue eyes that were currently burning with a volatile mixture of humiliation and barely leashed defiance. He watched as a man materialized at her side, broad-shouldered, flush-faced, radiating the specific, nauseating entitlement of someone who had never once been told no by anyone who mattered. The man looked her up and down, with the slow, deliberate appraisal of someone inspecting livestock. "I don't think we've been introduced." His voice was thick with expensive whiskey and cheap contempt. "Are you with the service staff, sweetheart? Be a good girl and fetch me something from the bar." The insult landed like a slap in a silent room. Lucy's face went very still, the kind of still that precedes either a storm or a surrender. Her knuckles whitened around her clutch. She was already turning, already preparing to absorb the humiliation quietly, to retreat with whatever shred of dignity she could salvage, when something shifted in the air across the room. Nino Mendel had made a decision. It was, by every rational metric he operated by, a reckless one. He was a man who had built an empire on the precise architecture of logic, on variables and outcomes, and the surgical elimination of unnecessary risk. What moved through him now was not logic. It was something older, something he had no clinical name for. He excused himself from Marco's orbit with a single, arctic look that brooked no argument, and crossed the ballroom. The crowd parted for him. It always did. He moved with the purposeful, unhurried stride of a surgeon walking into an emergency, a man who had already assessed the situation, already decided the outcome, and was simply arriving to execute it. He didn't stop until he was standing directly beside her. He didn't look at the man who had insulted her. The man ceased to exist. His entire focus, dark, unreadable, absolute, was on Lucy. He leaned in close enough that she caught the faint trace of cedar and something colder beneath it, like winter air. His lips brushed the shell of her ear, and when he spoke, his voice was barely a sound at all, a low, velvet whisper meant for no one in the room but her. "Pretend to be my wife." Lucy went completely still. She turned slowly and found herself looking up into a face she recognized from the kind of news stories that made people lower their voices and check over their shoulders. Sharp jaw, ink trailing up the column of his neck in dark, elegant patterns, eyes like polished obsidian, beautiful and entirely without warmth. Nino Mendel. The man who reportedly owned half the city's underground and the loyalty of the other half through fear alone. "What?" The word left her lips as barely a breath. "Play along," he said quietly, and something in his eyes caught the light, not warmth exactly, but the dangerous, electric glint of a man holding a live wire and choosing not to let go. "I will make it worth your while." Before she could form a coherent protest, he took her hand. His grip was warm, firm, absolutely certain of itself in a way that sent a bewildering current straight up her arm. He turned smoothly, unhurriedly, to face his waiting lieutenants. Marco's expression had gone dangerously blank. The woman in red silk had frozen mid-smile. Around them, the nearest cluster of Mendel's associates had gone very, very quiet. Nino's voice, when he spoke, carried with the effortless authority of a man who had never once needed to raise it to be heard. "Gentlemen," a pause, perfectly calibrated, "I believe you've been patient long enough. Allow me to end the evening's speculation." He drew Lucy gently to his side, a gesture so practiced it felt, to every eye in that room, like something done 1,000 times before, like gravity, like habit. "This," he said, with a smile that was all performance and absolutely devastating, "is my wife." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Lucy had ever heard. Marco looked as if the floor had shifted beneath his feet. The man who had insulted her, whose name she hadn't bothered to learn, stood with his whiskey glass suspended halfway to his lips, jaw unhinged, staring at the hand that Nino now raised slowly to his lips. The kiss he pressed to her knuckles was unhurried, deliberate, a declaration in the language these people understood best: power, performance, and the cold promise of consequence. His eyes never left hers. And Lucy, heart hammering against her ribs like something desperate to escape, understood with sudden, crystalline clarity that she had just stepped, willingly, wide-eyed, into the most dangerous arrangement of her life. She just didn't yet know about Article 11. Welcome to the Mendel Empire. Drop a comment and tell us, where in the world are you watching from and what time is it there? Don't forget to like and subscribe to join the inner circle. The contract hasn't been signed yet, but it will be. The florist shop on Carmine Street smelled of rain-damp soil and fresh-cut stems. A quiet, green world entirely removed from the one Lucy had stumbled into 3 nights ago. She had spent those 3 days trying to convince herself that the gala had been a fever dream, that she had not stood beside Nino Mendel while a room full of dangerous people rearranged their assumptions about the world, that his lips had not touched her knuckles like a signature on a document she hadn't yet read. She was trimming the thorns from a bundle of white roses when the bell above the door chimed. She didn't look up immediately. The morning rush had a rhythm to it: regulars, walk-ins, the occasional nervous man buying apology flowers, and she had learned to read it by sound alone. But this was different. The shop went quiet in a way it never did. The ambient noise of the street seemed to recede. Even the flowers, she would think later, seemed to hold still. She looked up. Nino Mendel stood in the doorway of her small, cluttered florist shop like a surgical instrument placed in the wrong room, impeccably tailored, devastatingly precise, and entirely out of context. His suit was the deep charcoal of a winter sky before snow, cut so perfectly to the architecture of his frame that it seemed less like clothing and more like a second skin. No tie, the top button of his shirt open. The ink at his throat visible, curling up toward his jaw like a quiet reminder of everything he was beneath the polish. He looked around the shop once, a single, unhurried sweep that cataloged everything, and then his eyes found hers with the same directness she remembered, like a key locating its lock. "Miss Vargas." Not a question. He said her name the way he seemed to do most things, as a statement of existing fact, as though uncertainty was a dialect he had never learned. Lucy set down her shears with a composure she did not entirely feel. "Mr. Mendel," she kept her voice even, "I don't remember giving you my address." "You didn't." He moved further into the shop. Unhurried, his hands clasped loosely behind his back as he glanced briefly at a bucket of blood-red peonies. "I have people for that." "Of course you do." He stopped at the worn wooden counter between them and regarded her with that same unreadable expression. Not cold, exactly, but absent of anything she could name. As though the normal human vocabulary of facial expression was something he had decided long ago was inefficient. "I'll be brief," he said. "I find brevity tends to be more respectful of everyone's time." "How considerate." Something shifted almost imperceptibly at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. An acknowledgement, perhaps, that she had drawn a small point. He reached into the interior breast pocket of his jacket and produced a slim, cream-colored envelope, which he placed on the counter between them with the quiet deliberateness of a chess piece being set down. "I have a proposal for you, a business arrangement clearly defined, legally binding, and mutually beneficial." He paused. "I need a wife, not a real one. I have no interest in the real version. I need a convincing one for a specific period, at specific functions, in specific contexts. In exchange, I will resolve the outstanding debt your family owes to Carmine Holdings. All of it, immediately." The air went out of the room. Lucy stared at him. The number attached to that debt, the one that had been living behind her sternum like a stone for 2 years, the one that had cost her sleep and her mother's health and her brother's university enrollment, lived in her mind with the permanence of a scar. She had not told anyone outside her family. She had certainly not told the man standing on the other side of her flower counter. "How do you know about that?" The question came out quieter than she intended. "I know most things that happen in this city," he said, without apology or elaboration. "It's how I've stayed alive." She looked at the envelope. She did not touch it. "And in return," she said carefully, "I simply perform." "Precisely. You are poised under pressure. I observed that at the gala. You are intelligent, presentable, and capable of discretion. These are the variables I require." Variables? The word landed with a particular flatness. Not unkind, exactly. Just clinical. She was, to him, a column in a spreadsheet, a solution to an equation. The realization settled over her with a chill that had nothing to do with the cool morning air coming in under the door. "And if I say no?" "Then I leave and we don't speak again." He said it without drama, without pressure, as though both outcomes were perfectly acceptable to him, as though she were simply a variable that could be replaced by another. "But I suspect you won't." The arrogance of it, the quiet, absolute certainty, should have made the decision easier. Should have made her pick up his envelope and hand it back across the counter with something sharp and final. Instead, she thought about her mother, about the phone calls she'd stopped answering, about the number that lived behind her sternum. She looked at the envelope for a long moment, then she picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. "I haven't said yes," she said. "No," Nino Mendel agreed, already turning toward the door, unhurried as ever. "But you will." The bell above the door chimed as he left. The shop exhaled around her. Lucy stood alone among her flowers, the envelope in her hand, and the faint, unshakable feeling that she had just been moved across a board by someone who had already seen the endgame. Nino treats people like variables in a machine. If you believe everyone deserves to be seen as a human being and not a pawn, hit subscribe and comment. I stand for respect. She had told herself she would read it in the shop, after closing, under the familiar comfort of her own fluorescent lights with a cup of tea going cold beside her. Practical, controlled, on her own terms. Instead, she found herself at her kitchen table at 11:30 at night, the envelope still sealed in front of her, her tea untouched, her brother's latest tuition deferral notice visible beneath the corner of a grocery receipt across the table. The apartment was quiet in the way that debt makes things quiet, a heavy, specific silence that has weight and texture, and a way of pressing against the walls. She opened the envelope. The document inside was not what she had expected. She wasn't sure what she had expected, something rough-edged, perhaps, something that felt like the underworld it originated from. Instead, the contract was immaculate. Crisp, cream-colored pages bound with a single black clip, the language precise and formal in the way of something that had been reviewed by lawyers who asked no questions and billed extraordinary hourly rates. It read, on its surface, like any high-end non-disclosure agreement between two parties entering a professional arrangement. Except it was a marriage. She read it carefully, the way she did everything methodically, with a quality of attention that her old professors had called her best and most stubborn trait. She read the scope of the arrangement, the duration, 14 months, with a possible extension at mutual discretion. She read the terms of her compensation, which made her breath catch despite herself. Full settlement of the Carmine Holdings debt, monthly allowance, private health care reinstated for her mother. Her brother's enrollment restored, tuition paid in full through graduation. It was everything, laid out in cold, clean clauses as though it were simply a matter of arithmetic. She read the behavioral expectations, public appearances, social functions, a credible performance of domesticity in the presence of his associates. She read the confidentiality terms, the exit provisions, the contingency arrangements. She read it all with the careful, deliberate pace of someone who understands that the thing you skim is always the thing that undoes you. And then she reached Article 11. It sat near the end of the document, formatted identically to every other clause, the same clean font, the same precise margins. Nothing about its appearance suggested it was any different from the 12 articles that preceded it. But she read it once, and then she stopped. And she read it again. Article 11, Emotional Integrity Safeguard. In the event that either party develops, or credibly presents evidence of having developed, a genuine emotional attachment to the other party, including but not limited to declarations of romantic intent, expressions of love, or conduct that a reasonable observer would interpret as arising from authentic personal feeling rather than the performance of the agreed arrangement. This contract shall be considered immediately and irrevocably terminated. All financial obligations to the non-breaching party shall be rendered null and void upon breach of this article. She sat very still. Outside, a car moved slowly down the wet street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling. Somewhere in the building above her, something creaked. She read it a third time, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something more reasonable. They didn't. He had built a wall into the foundation of the arrangement, not against scandal, not against exposure, not against the external threats that she had assumed would be the primary architecture of his concern. He had built the wall against feeling, had taken whatever it was that most people spent their lives reaching toward and codified it as a liability, as a breach, as the single condition under which everything, her mother's health, her brother's future, the weight she had been carrying alone for 2 years, would be taken back. The safeguard wasn't against enemies. It was against his own heart, and now, by extension, hers. She thought about the way he had looked at her across the florist counter that morning, that flat, assessing gaze that moved over her the way a surveyor moves over land. Variables. She was a variable. This clause was the mechanism by which he intended to ensure she remained one. A fierce, slow anger moved through her. The kind that doesn't arrive loudly, the kind that settles in with quiet permanence, like a cold front. And beneath the anger, something more complicated, because she understood it in spite of herself. She recognized the architecture of a person who had been hurt badly enough to build infrastructure around the wound. She had seen the blueprints before, in the mirror, in the years after her father left, and she had quietly, methodically rebuilt the family's finances on pride and stubbornness alone, rather than ask anyone for help. She understood building walls. She simply hadn't expected his to have a legal team. Lucy exhaled slowly through her nose. She looked at the document. She looked at her brother's deferral notice. She looked at the prescription bottle on the windowsill, her mother's, refilled last week on a credit card that was now essentially decorative. She reached for the pen. Her hand was steady until it wasn't. The moment the tip touched the signature line at the bottom of Article 11, not the final page, she realized, he had placed the signature line directly beneath the clause itself, so that signing required her to acknowledge it explicitly, deliberately, without the comfort of distance. Her fingers betrayed her. A fine tremor moved through them. Not fear, exactly. Something more precise than fear. The specific, cellular recognition of a person crossing a threshold they cannot uncross. She signed. The ink was dark and immediate against the cream page. Her name in full, slightly uneven at the end where her hand had not been entirely her own. She set the pen down. She sat back. The apartment held its heavy silence around her. 14 months. A performance. No feelings, no confessions, no foolishness of the heart. She could do that. She was practical. She was stubborn. She had been managing the impossible for years on nothing but sheer iron will. She could do that. She told herself this with great conviction. She almost believed it. Article 11 exists because someone broke him once. If you think everyone, even a man made of stone, deserves a second chance at being human, subscribe and comment, I stand for respect. The penthouse occupied the entire upper floor of a building that didn't appear in any public real estate listing, in a part of the city where the streets were quietly, comprehensively owned. Lucy arrived on a Tuesday morning with 2 suitcases and the rigid composure of someone reporting for a job they had researched thoroughly and intended to execute without incident. A woman named Sierra met her at the elevator, early 40s, silver-streaked hair pulled back with military precision, an expression that was professionally neutral in the way of someone who had seen everything, and filed it away without comment. She led Lucy through the penthouse with the efficient pace of a guided tour that was not particularly interested in whether its audience was keeping up. The space was extraordinary and almost aggressively impersonal. Vast windows, ceilings that belonged in a cathedral, furniture in shades of charcoal and bone, chosen with the kind of deliberate restraint that costs more than excess ever could. There were no photographs, no accumulated clutter of a life being lived. Every surface was precise and unoccupied, as though the apartment existed primarily as a concept rather than a home. "The East Wing," Sierra said, opening a door at the end of a long corridor, "is yours. Mr. Mendel's rooms are in the West Wing. You will not have cause to go there." The East Wing was beautiful. Of course it was. A bedroom with windows on 2 sides, a sitting room, a marble bathroom containing products Lucy recognized from the kind of magazines she read in waiting rooms. A wardrobe that had been stocked, she discovered when she opened it, with clothing in her exact size, understated, impeccable, chosen by someone with a forensic understanding of what it meant to look like you belonged somewhere. She stood in front of it for a long moment. Variables, she reminded herself. She was being optimized. She unpacked her 2 suitcases into one corner of the wardrobe, her own things deliberately visible among the curated selections, and told herself this was an act of self-preservation rather than stubbornness. Then she sat on the edge of the enormous bed, looked out at the city arranged below her like a map of someone else's empire, and got on with it. She did not see Nino until Thursday. He appeared in the kitchen at 7 in the morning while she was making coffee, dressed already in a suit the color of deep water, phone to his ear, conducting what appeared to be a quietly devastating conversation in Italian without looking up. He acknowledged her presence with a single nod. The same way, she imagined, he acknowledged furniture that had been correctly placed, poured himself an espresso with the efficiency of a man who had reduced every human need to its most time-effective form, and was gone. That evening, Sierra delivered a card to her sitting room on a small silver tray. An event. Saturday. Black tie. She was to be ready at 8. The card told her nothing about what the event was. It told her nothing about who would be there. It told her, in the careful negative space of its brevity, exactly how much her preparation and comfort were factored into the planning. She wore midnight blue. She did her own hair. The function was held in a building whose lobby alone contained more square footage than her entire apartment block. A foundation gala, philanthropic in its public architecture, political in every other sense. The room was full of people who wielded influence the way ordinary people wield conversation, casually, constantly, without thinking about it. Nino materialized at her side in the car on the way there, and something shifted in him the moment they pulled up to the entrance. She watched it happen with the quiet fascination of someone witnessing a professional transformation. The slight squaring of the shoulders, the calibration of the jaw, the eyes going from flat calculation to something that performed, with extraordinary precision, the warmth of a man who had chosen someone and was at peace with that choice. He offered her his arm at the door. She took it. Inside, he was immaculate. He introduced her with an ease that was almost insulting in its fluency, "My wife, Lucy," and the words moved through the room like a current, reshaping assumptions in real time. He kept his hand at the small of her back with the practiced naturalness of long habit, guided her through conversations she hadn't been briefed on, and twice leaned close to murmur context into her ear in a low voice that she felt more than heard. She matched him. She was surprised to discover how naturally she matched him, trading light words with the right people, laughing at precisely the right moments, letting her hand rest against his arm with a ease that required, by the end of the first hour, almost no conscious effort. It was somewhere in the second hour, mid-conversation with a silver-haired woman whose husband ran something vast and probably questionable in emerging markets, that Nino said something quietly amusing about Lucy's supposed opinion on a Sicilian vineyard they had allegedly visited together. She looked up at him to correct the detail and found him already looking at her, not performing, not calculating, but simply looking, with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something that had not yet decided what it was. The correction died in her throat. The silver-haired woman said something she didn't hear. The moment lasted less than 3 seconds. Then Nino looked away, smooth and unhurried, and the conversation continued, and everything was exactly as it had been. Except it wasn't. She felt it for the rest of the evening like a splinter, small, precise, and impossible to ignore. And across the room, in the long shadow cast by a marble pillar, a man she didn't yet know watched them both over the rim of his glass with the patient, satisfied expression of someone collecting evidence. His name was Gideon, and he had seen exactly what she had not meant to show. Gideon is watching, waiting for them to fail. If you can't stand bullies who use secrets as weapons, hit that like button and comment, "No room for snakes." She woke at 3 in the morning, with the sheets twisted around her, and a heat behind her eyes that made the ceiling pulse. For a moment she didn't know where she was. The room was too large, the silence too complete, the light from the city below too high up and too distant, like starlight from the wrong end of a telescope. Then it came back, the East Wing, the wardrobe full of other people's choices, the contract with its clean, terrible clauses, and she closed her eyes again and took careful stock of herself. It was bad, not dramatically bad, not the kind of bad that required emergency intervention, but the slow, grinding bad of a fever that had been building quietly for days beneath the threshold of acknowledgement, waiting for the moment she stopped moving long enough to arrive in full. Her throat felt lined with gravel. Her joints had opinions. The simple act of sitting up required a negotiation she nearly lost. She made it to the bathroom. She made it back. She located the paracetamol in her own toiletry bag. She had brought her own, on principle, took 2 with water that tasted like nothing, and lay back down in the enormous bed and stared at the ceiling and decided firmly that she would be fine by morning. She was not fine by morning. Sierra found her at 9, when she didn't appear for the breakfast that had, apparently, been silently added to the daily architecture of her residency without her being informed. She heard the knock, heard the door open, heard the brief pause that preceded Sierra's reappearance at her bedside with the expression of a woman rapidly revising her schedule. "I'll call the physician," Sierra said. "I don't need a physician," Lucy said, or tried to. It came out rougher than intended. Sierra looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a person who has worked for powerful, impossible people long enough to have developed an efficient relationship with the concept of noncompliance. "I'll call the physician," she said again and left. Lucy didn't have the energy to pursue it. She pulled the sheet up and drifted somewhere that wasn't quite sleep, populated by half-formed thoughts and the distant, muffled sound of the apartment conducting its business without her. She was not expecting Nino. She heard him before she saw him, not his voice, but the quality of the silence that preceded him, that specific rearrangement of atmospheric pressure that she had already, without intending to, learned to recognize as his. She opened her eyes. He was standing in the doorway of her bedroom in a suit that suggested he had been, or had been about to be, somewhere important. He was looking at her with that flat, assessing gaze. Then he looked at the untouched water glass on the nightstand, then back at her. He crossed the room, picked up the glass, and held it toward her with the wordless expectation of someone who did not anticipate being declined. She sat up slowly and took it, drank. The water helped marginally. "I have meetings," he said, which she took to mean he was leaving, and began constructing a response to the effect that she was perfectly capable of being ill without supervision. He took out his phone. She heard him speak briefly, 3 sentences, Italian, the last of which had a particular finality to it, and then he put the phone away. "You canceled," she said, not entirely hiding her surprise. "The meetings can be rescheduled." He said it with the same tone he might use to discuss a minor administrative adjustment, as though the decision had been entirely without cost. She knew enough about him by now, which was still very little. She reminded herself, which was exactly appropriate, to understand that this was not true. She had seen his calendar once, reflected briefly on Sira's tablet. It did not contain optional appointments. He pulled the chair from the corner of the room to the side of the bed, and sat in it with the composed, upright posture of a man who did not do anything so informal as lounging, opened his phone, and began to work. He stayed. The physician came at 11 and confirmed it was viral, prescribed rest and fluids and the kind of simple things that felt almost satirical in the context of this apartment. After she left, Sira appeared with a tray, clear broth, plain crackers, a small pot of ginger tea, and set it on the nightstand without comment. Nino, who had moved to the sitting room while the physician was there, came back. At some point in the early afternoon, Lucy woke from a shallow sleep to find the room dimmed, the automated blinds adjusted, she realized, against the brightness of the afternoon sun. The water glass had been refilled. The tray had been removed and replaced with a fresh one. Nino was in the corner chair, jacket off for the first time she could remember, shirt sleeves pushed to his forearms, working through documents in the quiet, focused way of a man who made productive use of every available surface, including other people's convalescence. She watched him for a moment before he noticed she was awake. There was something in it that she couldn't categorize and knew better than to examine. Something in the simple, unremarkable fact of another person choosing to be in the room, not performing it, not managing it, just there, in the quiet, with his sleeves rolled up and his careful, fractional attention divided between his work and the sound of her breathing. "You didn't have to stay," she said. Her voice was still rough. He looked up, that unreadable expression. Then, after a moment, "I'm aware." He looked back down at his documents. She fell asleep again to the soft sound of papers turning, and the dangerous, uninvited warmth of feeling, for the first time in a very long time, that she was not entirely alone. She would not think about Article 11 until morning. Nino broke his own cardinal rule today, and he knows it. If you believe that even the coldest hearts have a breaking point, like this video and comment, no room for snakes. They flew to Sicily on a Thursday, in a plane that had no airline markings and a cabin that was quieter than most libraries Lucy had been in. She sat across from Nino at a table of pale wood, while the Italian coastline assembled itself below them in pieces, terracotta and silver green, and the particular blue of water that has never had to apologize for itself, and pretended to read a book she had not absorbed a single sentence of since takeoff. Nino worked. He always worked. She had come to understand that his relationship with stillness was adversarial, that the constant, quiet industry was not ambition so much as architecture, something he had built around himself to ensure that the interior remained always occupied, always defended, never left unattended long enough for anything uninvited to move in. She understood this, she reminded herself, the way one understands a weather system, clinically, from an appropriate distance. The estate outside Palermo belonged to a man named Conti, an ally of Nino's, or the closest approximation his world permitted, who was hosting 3 days of meetings that required, for reasons Nino had explained briefly and she had understood completely, the visible, credible presence of a united domestic front. Conti was old world, old money. The kind of man for whom a wife was not an accessory but a character reference, and whose trust, once extended, opened doors that no amount of money or threat could otherwise move. "He will want to see us together," Nino had told her on the way to the airport, in the back of the car, with the particular efficient bluntness she had stopped flinching at. "Naturally together. He is observant and he has seen a great deal of performance in his life. He will know the difference." "Then we'll need to practice," Lucy had said, before she thought better of it. Nino had looked at her. "Yes," he said, "we will." The estate was extraordinary. A converted Baroque villa set into a hillside above the sea, all golden stone and bougainvillea, and the long blue shadows of cypress trees in the late afternoon light. Conti himself met them in the courtyard, a compact man in his 70s with sharp, unhurried eyes and the warm, encompassing handshake of someone who takes the full measure of a person in 3 seconds and never revises. He kissed Lucy's hand. He looked at her. Then he looked at Nino. Then he smiled, slowly, and said something in Sicilian dialect that made Nino respond with the closest thing to a genuine expression she had yet seen on him. "He says you have the eyes of a woman who does not suffer fools," Nino translated quietly at her ear as they were shown inside. "He considers this high praise." "Smart man," Lucy said. She felt, rather than saw, the fractional curve at the corner of Nino's mouth. The days had a rhythm she hadn't anticipated. Mornings were Nino's meetings conducted in Conti's stone-walled study, in a mixture of Italian and English, and the occasional silence that apparently communicated something she wasn't privy to. Lucy had the estate, the gardens, the library with its smell of aged paper and Mediterranean dust. She was not idle. She had been given, via Sira before departure, a detailed brief on every individual she would encounter, and she read it with the same methodical attention she had given Article 11, this time without the trembling. But the evenings belonged to both of them. Dinner on the terrace, the 4 of them, Conti, his wife Giuliana, and the 2 of them with the sea going dark below and candles burning in the warm, windless air. Lucy had not expected Giuliana, who was formidable and funny and asked questions with the precision of someone who had spent 50 years reading rooms. She asked about how they met. She asked about the early days. She asked, with the gentle, relentless warmth of a woman who had loved someone for a very long time, what it was that Lucy had first seen in him. And Lucy, who had prepared for many things, found herself answering without consulting the brief. She said she had noticed his hands first, the way they moved with a particular, unhurried certainty, as though he had already decided the outcome of every gesture before he made it. She said there was something in that which she had found, against her better judgment, completely disarming. She was not looking at Nino when she said it. She felt him looking at her. After dinner, they walked. This was not planned, not in the brief, not in any version of the arrangement she had agreed to. The path along the cliff above the water was Giuliana's suggestion, and there was no graceful way to decline, and so they walked in the dark and the warm salt air with the lights of Palermo distant across the bay, and the performance that had been so legible at the dinner table became, out here in the unwitnessed dark, something else entirely. He offered his arm on a descent where the path narrowed and the stones were uneven, a practical gesture. She took it, and they walked that way unhurried, close, his arm warm and solid beneath her hand, in a silence that required, she realized with a slow, cold clarity, no effort from either of them. No audience, no Conti, no Giuliana, no brief, no clause. Just the path and the sea and the particular, terrifying ease of it. "Lucy," he said her name differently than he used to. She had noticed this without meaning to, the way it had changed in his mouth over weeks from a fact to something that had weight and intention behind it. She looked at him. Whatever he had been about to say, he didn't. He looked out at the water instead, jaw set, and the moment passed like a wave that falls short of the shore. But it had come, and they both knew it. She thought about Article 11 all the way back to the villa, her hand still in the crook of his arm, her heart conducting itself with a recklessness that no contract had ever been written to contain. Nino's world is built on cold lies. If you believe that honesty is worth more than a billionaire's contract, subscribe now and comment, truth over gold. She saw it first on her phone at 6 in the morning, 3 days after they returned from Sicily, while the city was still gray and half-assembled outside the penthouse windows. The headline was not subtle. It never was with men like Gideon. Subtlety required patience, and what Gideon had released into the world overnight had the character of something that had been waiting too long already, a pressure that had built behind a wall until the wall became irrelevant. 42 pages, published simultaneously across 3 separate outlets, each one carefully chosen for its reach and its appetite. The document had a title that would have been almost literary in different hands. It called itself, with the flat precision of a weapon being named, The Mendel Doctrine, a portrait of a man who trades in people. Lucy read it the way she read everything, all the way through, without stopping. It was sophisticated, which made it worse. Gideon, she knew his name now, had learned it from Nino's associates in the careful, oblique way information moved in his world, had not made the amateur's mistake of fabricating. He had done something far more damaging. He had taken real things, true things. Moments and decisions and the documented architecture of Nino's methods, stripped of their context like bones stripped of everything that gives them meaning, and arranged them into a portrait so one-dimensional it became, paradoxically, more believable than the truth. The man in the document was a machine, calculating, without loyalty, without warmth, without the fundamental human capacity for genuine connection. Every business decision reframed as exploitation, every alliance recast as manipulation, and threaded through it, with a novelist's instinct for detail, the suggestion, never stated directly, always implied, that the marriage itself was a transaction, that Lucy was the latest in a series of managed variables, that anyone who had ever trusted Nino Mendel had been comprehensively, deliberately used. She put her phone down on the kitchen counter. She picked it up again and read the last section once more. Then she went to find him. He was in his study, a room she had been in only twice by necessity, a space of dark wood and ordered files and the faint smell of coffee that had gone cold. He was at his desk with the report open on his laptop and 2 phones face down beside him, which meant they had both been ringing, and he had decided that they were, for the moment, not his primary concern. He looked up when she came in. His face was composed, entirely, immaculately composed, in the way of a structure that has been engineered specifically to withstand a particular kind of load. She recognized it now, the way she had learned, over weeks of careful, unwilling attention, to read the things he didn't show. And what she read beneath the composure was something she had no clinical name for, not quite pain, not quite resignation. Something quieter and more total than either, like the expression of a man who has just seen confirmed the thing he has always privately believed about himself. That he deserves this, that this is what he amounts to. 42 pages and not one person left to argue otherwise. Something moved through her that was not in any clause of any document she had ever signed. "It's calculated," she said, crossing to his desk without invitation. "The Haverson account, the one he cites in Section 3 as evidence of exploitation, I read the brief Sierra gave me before the Conti meetings. I know what actually happened there. He's inverted the timeline deliberately. If anyone bothers to pull the original correspondence, the whole architecture falls apart." Nino looked at her. "I'm not finished," she said. "The sourcing on Section 7 is circular. He's citing himself through 2 intermediaries. Any journalist worth anything will see it if they look. And the implication about the marriage," she paused for half a breath, "is the weakest part of the entire document because it relies entirely on the reader not knowing me." Something shifted in his face. Not dramatically, just a fraction, a degree of reorientation, like a compass needle that has found a new north and is not yet sure what to do with the information. "Lucy, I'm going to make some calls," she said. "I know a financial journalist, not in your world, completely outside it, which is the point. She is thorough, and she does not like being used as someone else's instrument. If I give her the Haverson timeline and let her pull the thread herself, the counter-narrative will carry more weight than anything your people put out directly. You don't have to." I know I don't have to. She said it with a quiet, absolute firmness that surprised her slightly in the saying of it. I know what the contract says, and I know what it doesn't say, and I am choosing to do this. So please don't make it into something I need to justify to you. The silence that followed was different from the silences she had catalogued over weeks in this apartment. Those had been the silences of a man managing his interior. This one was unmanaged. This one had the quality of something that had come loose from its moorings and was moving, slowly, in an unfamiliar current. He stood up, slowly. He was close, the desk corner between them, and he looked at her with an expression she had no precedent for in any version of him she had yet encountered. Something that had not been through the clinical filter, something raw at the edges. Why? He said, and the word was so stripped of its usual architecture. No command, no calculation, nothing managed about it at all, that it took her a moment to recognize it as genuine. She met his eyes, held them. Because Gideon is wrong, she said simply, and I know it, and I will not stand in the same room as a lie I can correct and do nothing. He said nothing, but the last wall, the one she had watched him maintain through Sicily and illness and every dangerous, almost moment between them, moved. Not fell, but moved, the way glaciers move, irrevocably and without making a sound. Across the city, Gideon refreshed his notifications and waited for the silence that meant victory. He was going to wait a long time. Gideon wants to see Nino drown in loneliness. If you believe that everyone deserves a second chance at love, like this video and comment, love wins. It happened the way most inevitable things happen, not in a moment of grand orchestration, but in the quiet aftermath of one, when the adrenaline had receded and left behind it only the truth of what remained. Lucy's journalist contact had done exactly what she'd promised. By midday, the counter-narrative was moving through the right channels with the self-sustaining momentum of something that had the advantage of being true. By evening, 2 of the 3 outlets that had run Gideon's report had appended corrections. The Haverson timeline, once pulled and examined by someone with no allegiance to either side, had unraveled his central thesis with the quiet efficiency of a single thread drawn from a knot. It wasn't over. Men like Gideon did not accept conclusions they hadn't authored, but the ground had shifted decisively, and everyone in Nino's world who was paying attention knew it. Nino had spent the day in controlled, relentless motion, calls, meetings, the precise and unsentimental work of managing consequences. Lucy had stayed out of his orbit, operating in parallel, communicating through Cira with the efficient shorthand they had developed over weeks. It felt, she thought at one point in the long afternoon, remarkably like a partnership. The real kind. The kind that didn't require a clause to define its boundaries because it had no interest in them. She did not think about Article 11. She thought about it constantly. It was past 10 when the penthouse went quiet. She was in the sitting room off the east wing with a glass of wine she had been intending to drink for an hour, looking out at the city without seeing it, when she heard him in the corridor. His footsteps. She had learned those too, without meaning to, the particular, unhurried cadence of a man who moved as though he had already decided where he was going. He stopped in the doorway. She didn't turn immediately. She could see his reflection in the dark window, jacket gone, tie gone, the shadows under his eyes that spoke of a day that had required more than its share of himself. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time and had just become aware of the precise weight of it. She turned. He crossed the room, not with the purposeful surgeon's stride she had catalogued at the gala, not with the managed deliberateness she had come to associate with his movements in public. This was different. This was someone moving toward something they have decided to stop reasoning themselves out of. He stopped in front of her. Close. The city light caught the ink at his throat and the particular unguarded quality of his expression that she had seen only in fragments before, on a cliff path above the Sicilian Sea, in his study with 42 pages of lies open on his desk, in the corner chair of her room with his sleeves rolled up and her breathing the only sound. "What you did today," he said, and stopped, recalibrated, as though the sentence he had begun was not the right instrument for what he was trying to convey. "No one in my world does that. No one moves toward the fire. They calculate the exits. I'm not in your world, Lucy said. I'm adjacent to it, on a temporary contractual basis. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, not quite pain. Lucy. Don't, she said quietly, because she could hear where it was going. And she knew with a clarity that was almost physical that if he said the words out loud, there would be no return to the careful geography they had maintained. And part of her, the practical, stubborn, contract-reading part, was still, even now, trying to locate the exit. I have spent, he said, with the slow, deliberate precision of a man choosing each word the way you choose footing on uncertain ground. 14 years building a life in which the primary objective was never to be in this position, in which every variable was accounted for, in which feeling something for someone was a liability I had successfully, entirely, eliminated. He paused. I had not accounted for you. The wine glass was still in her hand. She wasn't sure why she was still holding it. She set it down on the table beside her, very carefully, as though the gesture might buy her another moment of the world as it had been arranged before this one. It didn't. Article 11, she said. The words came out barely above a breath. I know, he said. If we... I know, he said again, and the repetition was not impatience, but something far more unguarded, the sound of a man who has run the calculation already, who knows the cost, who is standing here anyway. She didn't decide to close the distance between them. Or rather, the decision happened somewhere below the level of language, in whatever part of a person operates before the contract and after the clause, in the place that had been accumulating evidence for weeks without her permission. When he kissed her, it was not tentative. There was nothing in it of performance or management or the careful, calibrated restraint she had come to associate with every move he made. It was hungry, and it was consuming, and it was, above everything else, honest, the most honest thing she had encountered in the entire architecture of their arrangement. And she kissed him back with the full, reckless weight of everything she had spent months refusing to name. When they separated, the silence was total. His forehead rested against hers. His eyes were closed. She could feel his breath, uneven in a way she had never heard from him before. I love you, she said, because there was simply nothing else left to say. Because every other sentence she could construct was a smaller, lesser thing, and she was done with smaller things. He opened his eyes. That, he said quietly, is a breach of Article 11. I know, she said. So is this. He cupped her face in both hands with a gentleness that had no precedent in anything she knew of him. I love you, Lucy. I have been trying not to since Sicily. The contract, somewhere in the ordered files of his study, had just terminated itself. Neither of them moved to acknowledge it. The clause couldn't hold. It never could. If you believe love is worth the breach, like this video and comment, love wins. She woke to the particular quality of silence that follows a significant thing. Not empty silence, full silence, the kind that has weight and history, that carries the shape of everything said in the hours before it. The city was doing its early morning assembly outside the windows, gray light arriving without commitment, and Lucy lay still for a long moment in the vast bed and took careful, honest inventory of herself the way she had learned to do in hard seasons. What she found was not what she expected. Not the bracing, post-reckless clarity of regret. Something quieter. Something that sat in her chest with the settled permanence of a thing that has finally been placed correctly after a long time in the wrong position. She found Nino in the kitchen. He was already dressed, not in the full precision of his public armor, but in dark trousers and a shirt not yet buttoned at the collar, which she had come to understand was the closest he came to informality. He was making coffee with the focused efficiency of a man who had decided that this ordinary task deserved his complete attention. He looked up when she came in. They regarded each other for a moment across the kitchen. Something had changed in the topography of the space between them. The careful, managed distance that had been the primary feature of their shared geography was simply gone, and what remained was both more exposed and more navigable, like a coastline after a tide has gone out. He poured her coffee without asking. She accepted it without thanking him. Both of these things felt, in context, like a language more precise than either. "There are things I've done," he said, after a moment, looking at his own cup with the expression of a man choosing to be accurate rather than palatable. "Decisions made in the years before you that cannot be undone and that I am not going to insult you by minimizing. You should know that. You should know the full weight of what adjacency to my world actually means, not the managed version I have permitted you to see." "I've been reading the full version for months," she said. "I'm not operating under a deficit of information." He looked at her. Something moved through his expression, not quite gratitude, something more complicated than that, the look of a man who is expected to be managed and finds instead that he is being met. He set his cup down. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, which was folded over the back of the kitchen chair, and placed two things on the counter between them. The first was an envelope, thicker than the one he had delivered to her florist shop, which felt like a different geological era. She opened it. Inside was a single page from a law firm she recognized by name only, as the kind of firm that existed in the register of institutions too established to require advertising. The document confirmed the complete, irrevocable settlement of the Carmine Holdings debt, not a payment plan, not a contingent arrangement. A termination of liability, dated that morning, witnessed and sealed. Below it, a second document, her brother's enrollment reinstated, 4 years of tuition held in an educational trust that bore her name as administrator, not Nino's. Her mother's health care extended under a private policy that required no renewal, no review, and no continued association with Nino Mendel or any of his interests to remain active. Irrevocable. The word appeared 3 times across the 2 documents. She understood that this was deliberate. She looked up. "These are not contingent," he said before she could speak. "They are not conditional on any decision you make today or any day after it. They are yours. They were always going to be yours, that was the arrangement, and I honor arrangements regardless of what else may or may not have occurred between the parties." A pause. "I want to be very clear about that distinction." She understood what he was doing. He was removing the architecture of obligation. He was ensuring that whatever she did next, she did without the weight of her family's need pressing on one side of the scale. He was, in the most precise and painful way she could imagine, setting the terms of a genuinely free choice. She looked at the second thing on the counter. It was a plain ticket. Printed, not digital, she registered this detail with a part of her mind that noticed everything, the deliberateness of making it physical, tangible, something she could hold. An open-ended return to the city where her mother lived, where her brother was enrolled, where her florist shop still smelled of rain-damp soil and fresh-cut stems, and the life she had been living before a bell above a door had chimed and rearranged everything. No return date. "I am not asking you to stay," Nino said. His voice was level. Completely, effortfully level in the way of someone who has decided that the person in front of them deserves honesty more than they deserve the comfort of having it softened. "I am asking you to choose, without the contract, without the debt, without any of the variables that brought you into this apartment in the first place." Another pause, shorter. "I need to know, I find that I need to know, which is itself a condition I had previously considered impossible, whether any version of you would choose this. Choose me, outside the clause, outside the arrangement, for no reason that can be reduced to a column in a ledger." He stopped. He looked at her with the unguarded, unmanaged expression she had first seen in a study full of lies, and learned, in the weeks since, to understand as the truest version of him. "If the answer is no," he said quietly, "the car will take you to the airport. You will want for nothing, and I will consider the matter." The faintest fracture, almost imperceptible in the composure, resolved. The ticket was light in her hand. The documents were on the counter. The kitchen was very quiet. Lucy looked at the man who had built an empire on the precise exclusion of this exact moment, who had written a legal clause to prevent himself from arriving here, who had arrived here anyway, and was now standing in his own kitchen in an unbuttoned collar asking her, with the full stripped vulnerability of someone who has run out of walls to stand behind, to tell him the truth. She set the plane ticket down on the counter. She picked up her coffee. I'm going to need, she said, a much bigger wardrobe. Something broke open in his face. Quietly. Completely. The way light enters a room not through a window thrown wide, but through a single crack that turns out to be enough. He exhaled, one breath, long and slow and entirely unmanaged. And for the first time since she had known him, Nino Mendel smiled. Not the dazzling, calibrated performance of the gala, not the fractional acknowledgement she had learned to collect like evidence, but the real thing. Unguarded and a little undone and so entirely human that it rearranged. In one moment, every remaining assumption she had been storing about who he was beneath the empire and the ink and the cold, careful architecture of a man who had decided long ago that love was a liability. It turned out it was, the most beautiful kind. The contract was a cage for both of them. If you're not siding with a broken system that punishes the heart, hit subscribe and comment, break the rules. She did go home. Not because she was uncertain. The moment the ticket left her hand and landed back on the counter, she had been certain in a way that required no further examination. But because certainty, she had come to understand, was not the same thing as completion. There were things that needed doing. Her mother's face when Lucy sat across from her at the kitchen table and told her, quietly and completely, that the debt was gone. That specific expression, the slow collapse of attention held so long it had become structural. The way her mother's shoulders descended half an inch as 14 months of impossible weight simply ceased to exist. That was not something she could have received secondhand. She needed to be in the room for it. She needed to carry it back with her. Her brother drove her to the airport 4 days later. He talked the entire way about his reinstatement, about his professors, about a research project he'd been unable to pursue while on deferral that he could now return to. His words coming in the rapid, slightly disbelieving cadence of someone still in the early stages of good news. She listened with the full, unhurried attention of someone who has learned, recently, and at some cost, the precise value of being present for ordinary things. At the departure gate, he hugged her with the unself-conscious force of someone who had not yet learned to make his affection efficient, and she held on longer than she usually permitted herself. "Are you happy?" he asked when they separated. Blunt in the way only younger siblings can be, no apparatus around it, just the question, direct and genuine. She considered it, not because the answer was complicated, but because it deserved the dignity of an honest moment rather than a reflex. "Yes," she said, "I think I am. I think I'm also terrified, which I've recently been advised are not mutually exclusive conditions." He looked at her with the particular expression of a 22-year-old encountering an emotional complexity he suspects he will not fully understand for another decade. "Cool," he said. "Don't let him be weird about it." She laughed, properly, fully, the kind that arrives without warning and exits the same way. She hadn't done that enough. She intended to do it more. The flight back felt different from the flight to Sicily, which had been taught with performance anxiety and the studied management of proximity. This one was simply forward motion. She watched the city assemble itself below the descent path and felt, without drama, that she was going somewhere rather than returning somewhere, which was a distinction she had not previously understood from the inside. Cira was not at the elevator. This was new. The penthouse when she entered was quiet in the particular way of a space recently vacated by its usual industry. No phones, no papers, no ambient hum of empire being managed. She set her bag down in the entrance and stood for a moment, orienting. She found him in the kitchen. Not working, not on his phone, not conducting the relentless, defensive occupation of every available moment that she had spent months cataloging as his primary coping mechanism. He was standing at the counter with 2 cups of coffee already made, in the dark trousers and open-collared shirt that she had come to understand as his version of laid-down arms, and he was doing nothing except, apparently, waiting. He looked up when she came in. She crossed the kitchen and picked up one of the cups. She was aware of him watching her with an expression that was fully, unguardedly warm in a way that still had the capacity to briefly reorganize her breathing. "How is your mother?" he asked. "Lighter," Lucy said. She looked lighter, it's the right word. He nodded once, as though receiving something he had hoped for but not permitted himself to expect. Then he reached past her to the counter, and she saw that there was something else there. Not an envelope this time, not a document with clean margins and the fingerprints of expensive lawyers. A napkin. The kind that came in a dispenser, thin and slightly utilitarian, from the cafe 2 blocks from the florist shop on Carmine Street. She recognized it with a small, startled precision, recognized the logo printed faintly in the corner, and understood that he had gone there. That he had gone to the place that was hers, the unremarkable, rain-damp-smelling origin point of all of this, and retrieved a napkin from it like a person collecting something that mattered. He had written on it in his handwriting, which was spare and exact and looked exactly as she would have predicted. A single line. I promise to break Article 11 every day. Below it, his signature, and a line beneath that, blank, waiting. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at him. His expression had the quality she had first glimpsed on a cliff path above the Sicilian Sea and had been learning, in increments, to read without flinching, open. Undefended, and entirely at her mercy, in a way that a man who had spent 14 years building walls against this exact condition had no remaining infrastructure to conceal. She set her coffee down. She picked up the pen he had left beside the napkin, an ordinary pen, not the weighted, deliberate instrument he had used to execute the contract. Another choice she recognized as intentional. She signed her name beneath his, slightly uneven at the end, as it had been on Article 11, but for an entirely different reason this time. This time her hand was warm. She slid the napkin back toward him. Binding, she said. Irrevocable, he agreed. He took her hand across the counter, warm, certain, no performance in it at all, and the city went about its vast, indifferent business 40 floors below them, and Gideon refreshed his notifications into the silence of a man who had mistaken transaction for truth and lost. And the napkin sat between 2 coffee cups with the easy, unassailable authority of the only document in the history of the Mendel Empire that had ever been written from the inside of something rather than around it. No clause, no safeguard, no architecture of managed distance. Just 2 signatures, and the daily, chosen, magnificent breach of everything they had agreed at the beginning to protect themselves from. It turned out the protection they had needed was exactly this. It always had been. Gideon lost, and love found a way. If you believe in happy endings over toxic games, subscribe now and comment, I choose love. Thank you for staying with us through every chapter of the Mendel Empire. We'll see you in the next story.